The Northeast Regional is the busiest Amtrak train route in the United States, serving over 8.5 million people every year between Massachusetts and Virginia.
We rode it all the way from Washington, D.C. up to Boston, and now we're going to tell you what you can expect on the journey and whether or not we recommend it. Hi, I'm Adam.
And I'm Phoebe.
And we are the couple from In the Great Wide. We did a month-long train trip across the U.S. and back, starting and ending in Los Angeles.
We spent a few days in New York City. It was my first time there with a good friend to show us around Brooklyn and the Lower East Side. And while we were sad to move on from New York, we were eager to visit the nation's capital. So we took the Northeast Regional south to Washington, D.C.
After spending time in D.C. and enjoying some incredible monuments, we took the Northeast Regional back north all the way up to Boston.
The main Northeast Regional route runs between Boston and Newport News, Virginia, with alternate routes starting and ending in Virginia Beach, Roanoke, Virginia, and Springfield, Massachusetts.
It hits a ton of major cities like New York City, Philadelphia, Providence, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Richmond, Virginia.
All of these route options and the fact that the route runs multiple times a day makes the Northeast Regional the busiest Amtrak route in the country, like we said, serving upwards of 8.5 million people per year.
The longest route is between Newport News and Boston, which takes 12.5 hours. But the route we took from New York City to Washington, D.C. took 4 hours, and the route back up from D.C. to Boston was supposed to take 8, but we had some significant delays due to a fire on an overhead bridge in Philadelphia, which forced us to be 5 hours late getting into Boston.
Yeah, it was the most significant delay of our month-long train trip, and it forced us to abandon our plans to explore Boston, which were already on a pretty tight schedule, because the only full day that we had in the area, we actually spent in Salem, Massachusetts.
Yeah. We didn't have any problems going from New York to D.C., but in Philadelphia, that bridge was on fire. It
was crazy. We just sat at a train station in Delaware for 2.5 hours.
Yeah, it was a long time.
Yeah.
Long.
But on the route between DC and Boston, you'll get to see some historic churches and colonial buildings, plus a ton of waterfront views, including Chesapeake Bay, the Delaware River, and the Long Island Sound.
It's totally different from the West Coast Pacific Ocean views on the Coast Starlight, but I remember feeling blown away by the fact that we had traveled from one ocean to the other by train, which we did via the Coast Starlight, California Zephyr, Capital Limited, and Pennsylvanian using the USA Rail Passes.
Seeing the waterways lined with civilization was really cool. It's obvious that this section of the country is much older than where we live in Los Angeles.
On the route north from DC to Boston, after you pass under the East River to emerge into Brooklyn, you'll jog north and get some great skyline views of Upper Manhattan and the Bronx before following the Long Island Sound. We finally got to see the skyline.
We finally got to see the New York skyline.
It wasn't the Manhattan skyline, the downtown skyline, but it was still really cool and just shows you how huge that island is and how many tall buildings are on it. It's really crazy.
Yeah. And the further north you go, past Bridgeport and New Haven, the more industrial the countryside becomes before turning back into agricultural land in Massachusetts, giving you some amazing fall colors if you go at the right time of year.
If you've seen our review of the Amtrak Pennsylvanian train, you'll know that some of the Amtrak trains are more commuter style and some are meant for more leisure, such as the Coast Starlight and California Zephyr, where you'll have more legroom. There are private room options, there's an observation car on the double-decker train, and most often there's no Wi-Fi.
The commuter-style trains, however, are a single deck, still with a cafe car but no observation car, and they have less comfortable seats with less legroom, although the seats will still vary by specific train, but they usually have Wi-Fi.
Yeah. The commuter-style trains have less space because they're not really meant for long-haul or overnight travel.
Amtrak is expecting you to travel on this train in short jumps, so extra room isn't really necessary, but the Northeast Regional does offer overnight service. So if you're thinking of taking this route overnight, we would actually recommend you don't and just fly instead.
Flights from DC to Boston are actually cheaper on average than an individual ticket on this train. So the whole point of the train is for the views, but if you're on it at night, you won't be able to see anything. And sleeping in coach on the train would be just like sleeping on a red-eye flight, except that there's just no middle seat on the train.
The seats are still comfortable, but not nearly as comfortable as on the leisure trains, or leisure, as Adam says. The legroom is drastically smaller than the leisure trains, and even on the Pennsylvanian, too.
Yeah, the amount of legroom is akin to what you would get on an airplane, but again, at least there's no middle seat.
Yeah. Multiple online sources also claim that this route offers private sleeper cars on a few of the trains on this route, but we cannot find a single ticket available for them. So I'm pretty sure it's just coach and business class.
Business class costs between 30 to 75% more than coach, but it doesn't get you too much of an upgrade other than extra leg room, which would be nice on this train.
Yeah.
But we did find the coach class cars to be sufficient.
Yeah. The tray tables on this train actually laid flat, unlike ours on the Pennsylvanian, so we were able to work from coach.
Yeah.
And there is a cafe car, so you can eat at an actual table, or you can spread out for some more intense work, keeping in mind, of course, that the tables are meant for eating first, so don't hog them just for work.
They offer various selections at breakfast, lunch, and dinner, an even better selection, I think, than the leisure trains, plus beers, wine, and liquors.
You're not allowed to bring your own alcohol on board, but you are allowed to bring your own food and non-alcoholic drinks.
There is Wi-Fi available on the train, and it proved to be the strongest of all the routes we took, which makes sense since we were surrounded by dense populations for almost the entire time we were on the route, whereas some of the other routes, like the California Zephyr, go through remote canyons in the Rocky Mountains.
And there were no assigned seats when we were on the train, and it didn't seem like the attendants were very keen on moving people around to help partners sit together. So just be aware that if you're traveling with someone, you may have to split up unless someone is kind enough to move.
We didn't have this problem, but some people who got on the train later in the day actually did.
Yeah. Overall, the Northeast Regional is about as close as you'll get to what the trains are like in Europe, with multiple trains running per day and faster service, assuming that there's no fires on bridges.
Yeah, these aren't obviously like your Japanese speed trains or even some of the European trains that can get you like essentially the equivalent of a Boston to Newport News in about 3 hours.
Yeah.
Rather than 12 and a half. The trains in the US are just not set up that way.
Yeah.
Mostly the train tracks are not set up that way. They wouldn't be able to handle that kind of speed.
Right. We're hoping that someday the rest of America will follow suit with the rest of the world with the speed trains, but we understand that it's a really big country full of people who love cars, so it would take a major societal shift for the trains to be upgraded in that way.
Yeah. Definitely more people would have to be riding the trains and make it worthwhile for them to be doing it, or the trains would have to be nationalized and run by the government.
Right, yeah.
Which doesn't seem like either of those things are going to happen anytime soon, so...
But, really the question is, would we ride this route again?
Would we?
Well, I think maybe if we were going a shorter distance, like New York to Boston or New York to DC, those like 4-hour train rides, or if we were going to one of the destinations that doesn't have a major airport.
Yeah. Otherwise, you can find flights that are actually cheaper and faster than the train ride.
Yeah. It was nice to do this route once because there are some really nice views, but it wasn't nice enough that we'd be willing to pay more for every time we're going between these destinations. But if you have a USA Rail Pass, you should definitely use this route because there are so many places you can go. To get even more details about this train, like luggage allowances and what the coach seats are like, plus suggestions for stuff you can do once you get where you're going on the train, head to the link in the description to check out our website and sign up for our newsletter. We release new blog posts and new videos every Tuesday and Thursday.
Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the Great Wide somewhere.